Welcome back. Let's read another one.
Air Force One. For the current aircraft most commonly used as Air Force One, see Boeing VC-25. For the 1997 film, see Air Force One, film. For the Nike sneaker, see Nike Air Force. For other uses, see Air Force One, disambiguation. Air Force One is the official air traffic control designated call sign for United States Air Force aircraft carrying the President of the United States. In common parlance, the term is used to denote U.S. Air Force aircraft modified and used to transport the President and a metonym for the primary presidential aircraft, VC-25, although it can be used to refer to any Air Force aircraft the President travels on. The idea of designating specific military aircraft to transport the President arose during World War II when military advisors in the War Department were concerned about the risk of using commercial airlines for presidential travel. A C-54 Skymaster was then converted for presidential use. Dubbed the Sacred Cow, it carried President Franklin D. Roosevelt to the Yalta Conference in February 1945 and was used for another 2 years by President Harry S. Truman. The Air Force One call sign was created in 1953, after a Lockheed Constellation carrying President Dwight D. Eisenhower entered the same airspace as a commercial airline flight using the same flight number. Since the introduction of SAM 26000 in 1962, the primary presidential aircraft has carried the distinctive livery designed by Raymond Loewy. Other aircraft designated as Air Force One have included another Lockheed Constellation, Columbine 3, 3 Boeing 707s, introduced in the 1960s and 1970s, and the current Boeing VC-25 as. Since 1990, the presidential fleet has consisted of two highly customized Boeing 747-200B, VC-25 aircraft. The USAF has ordered two Boeing 747-8s to serve as the next presidential aircraft, with designation VC-25B. History, edit. 20th century, edit. On the 11th of October, 1910, Theodore Roosevelt became the first U.S. president to fly in an aircraft, an early Wright flyer from Kinloch Field near St. Louis, Missouri. He was no longer in office at the time, having been succeeded by William Howard Taft. The record-making occasion was a brief overflight of the crowd at a county fair but was nonetheless the beginning of presidential air travel. First presidential aircraft, edit. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the first president to fly in an aircraft while in office. The first aircraft obtained specifically for presidential travel was a Douglas Dolphin amphibian delivered in 1933 which was designated Road 2 by the U.S. Navy and based at the Naval Base at Anacostia, D.C. The Dolphin was modified with luxury upholstery for 4 passengers and a small separate sleeping compartment. The aircraft remained in service as a presidential transport from 1933 until 1939. During World War II, Roosevelt traveled on the Dixie Clipper, a Pan Am crewed Boeing 314 flying boat to the 1943 Casablanca Conference in Morocco, a flight that covered 5,500 miles, 8,890 kilometers, in 3 legs. The threat from the German submarines throughout the Battle of the Atlantic made air travel the preferred method of VIP transatlantic transportation. Concerned about relying upon commercial airlines to transport the President, officials of the United States Army Air Forces, the predecessor to the U.S. Air Force, ordered the conversion of a military aircraft to accommodate the special needs of the Commander-in-Chief. The first dedicated aircraft proposed for presidential use was a C-87, a VIP transport aircraft. This aircraft, number 41 to 24,159, was modified in 1943 for use as a presidential VIP transport. The Guess Where To, intended to carry President Franklin D. Roosevelt on international trips. Had it been accepted, it would have been the first aircraft to be used in presidential service. After a review of the C-87's highly controversial safety record in service, the Secret Service flatly refused to approve the Guess Where To for presidential carriage. As the C-87 was a derivative of the consolidated B-24 Liberator bomber, it presented strong offensive impressions to enemy fighter aircraft as well as foreign destinations visited, an issue not present with airplanes that were used purely for transport. The Guess Where To was used to transport senior members of the Roosevelt administration on various trips. In March 1944, it transported Eleanor Roosevelt on a goodwill tour of several Latin American countries. The C-87 was scrapped in 1945. The Secret Service subsequently reconfigured a Douglas C-54 Skymaster for presidential transport duty. The VC-54C aircraft, nicknamed the Sacred Cow, included a sleeping area, radio telephone, and retractable battery-powered elevator to lift Roosevelt in his wheelchair. As modified, the VC-54C was used by President Roosevelt only once before his death, on his trip to the Yalta Conference in February 1945. The National Security Act of 1947, the legislation that created the U.S. Air Force, was signed by President Harry S. Truman while on board the VC-54C. He replaced the VC-54C in 1947 with a modified C-118 Liftmaster, calling it the Independence after his Missouri hometown. It was given a distinctive exterior, as its nose was painted like the head of a bald eagle. The plane, which included a stateroom in the aft fuselage and a main cabin that could seat 24 passengers or could be made up into 12 sleeper berths, is now housed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Eisenhower introduced 4 propeller-driven aircraft to presidential service. This group included 2 Lockheed C-121 Constellations, aircraft Columbine II, VC-121A 48-610, and Columbine III, VC-121E 53-7885. They were named by First Lady Mamie Eisenhower for the Columbine, official state flower of her adopted home state of Colorado. In addition, 2 Aero Commanders were also added to the fleet. Columbine II is the first plane to bear the call sign Air Force One. This designation for the U.S. Air Force aircraft carrying the incumbent president was established after an incident in 1953, when Eastern Airlines 8610, a commercial flight, crossed paths with Air Force 8610, which was carrying President Eisenhower. Initially used informally, the designation became official in 1962. Boeing 707S and entry to jet age, edit. Toward the end of Eisenhower's second term, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles commented that Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and other senior Soviet officials had begun using the technologically advanced Tupolev Tu-114 aircraft for their travels, and it was no longer dignified for the president to fly in a propeller-driven aircraft. This paved the way for the Air Force's initial procurement of 3 Boeing 707-120, VC-1370, jet aircraft, designated SAM, Special Air Missions, 970, 971 and 972. The high-speed jet technology built into these aircraft enabled presidents from Eisenhower through Nixon to travel long distances more quickly for face-to-face meetings with world leaders. Then Vice President Richard Nixon first used a VC-137 on his visit to Russia in July 1959 for the kitchen debates. The following month, Eisenhower became the first president to fly via jet airplane when he used SAM-970, nicknamed Queenie, to meet German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. During Eisenhower's flight to Peace Goodwill Tour in December 1959, he visited 11 Asian nations, flying 22,000 miles, 35,000 kilometers, in 19 days, twice as fast as he could have covered that distance in one of the Columbines. SAM-970 to SAM-972 would be removed from the presidential role with the early 1960s arrival of the specially built VC-137C designated SAM-26000. The older planes would be repainted in the Loewy secondary livery designed for Air Force Two and other non-presidential VIP aircraft. SAM-970 is now on display at the Museum of Flight in Seattle, Washington. SAM-971, best remembered for returning the Americans held during the Iran hostage crisis in 1981, is on display at the Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona. SAM-972 was scrapped in October 1996. Loewy's livery design, edit. The new VC-137C was not yet modified for presidential service when John F. Kennedy took office in 1961. On the recommendation of his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, he contacted the French-born American industrial designer Raymond Loewy for help in designing new livery and interiors for the VC-137C. Loewy, who had seen SAM-970, complained to a friend in the White House that it had a garish orange nose and looked too much like a military plane. Air Force One historian and former Smithsonian curator Von Hardesty told CNN. He offered Kennedy his design consultation services free of charge. Kennedy chose a red and gold design from one of Loewy's initial concept sketches, and asked him to render the design all in blue. Loewy also drew inspiration from the first printed copy of the United States Declaration of Independence, suggesting the widely spaced and uppercase United States of America legend in cast-long typeface. He chose to expose the polished aluminum fuselage on the bottom side and used two blues, steel blue associated with the early republic and the presidency, and a more contemporary water blue to represent an America both rooted in the past and flying inexorably into the future. The presidential seal was added to both sides of the fuselage near the nose and a large American flag was painted on the tail. Loewy's work won immediate praise from the president and the press. The cheat line suggested a sleek and horizontal image that mirrored America's jet age optimism and prosperity of the era, and today signifies its legacy and tradition. Loewy's VC-137C livery was adapted for the larger VC-25 when it entered service in 1990, and the secondary variation, without the darker blue cheat line and cap over the cockpit, is still in use on USAF C-40, C-37, C-32, and C-20 aircraft in standard, non-presidential, VIP configurations. The presidential paint scheme can also be seen on Union Pacific 4141, the locomotive used in George H.W. Bush's funeral train. SAM 26000, edit. Main article, VC-137C SAM 26000. Under John F. Kennedy, presidential air travel entered the jet age. Although he could use the Eisenhower-era jets for trips to Canada, France, Austria, and the United Kingdom, when he came into office, his primary aircraft domestically was still a prop-powered Douglas VC-118 Liftmaster. In October 1962, the modified long-range Boeing VC-137C Stratolina SAM 26000, featuring livery designed by Loewy would be delivered, and immediately became an important element of the Kennedy administration's brand. Some 26,000 was in service from 1962 to 1998, serving Presidents Kennedy to Clinton. On the 22nd of November, 1963, some 26,000 carried President Kennedy to Dallas, Texas, where it served as the backdrop as the Kennedys greeted well-wishers at Dallas's Love Field. Later that afternoon, Kennedy was assassinated, and Vice President Lyndon Johnson assumed the office of President and took the oath of office aboard some 26,000. On Johnson's orders, the plane carried Kennedy's body back to Washington. A decade later, some 26,000 took Johnson's body home to Texas after his state funeral in Washington. The U.S. Air Force usually does not have fighter aircraft escort the presidential aircraft over the United States, but it has occurred. The first instance came during the state funeral of John F. Kennedy, when it was followed by 50 fighters, 20 Navy and 30 Air Force, representing the states of the Union. Johnson used some 26,000 to travel extensively domestically and to visit troops in South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Some 26,000 served President Nixon on several groundbreaking overseas voyages, including his famous visit to the People's Republic of China in February 1972 and his trip to the Soviet Union later that year, both firsts for an American president. Nixon dubbed the plane the Spirit of 76 in honor of the forthcoming bicentennial of the United States. That logo was painted on both sides of the plane's nose. Some 27000, edit. Main article, VC137C some 27,000. Some 26,000 was replaced in December 1972 by another VC-137C, Special Air Mission 27,000, although some 26,000 was relegated to non-presidential VIP status, and repainted without the darker blue cap and cheat line. It served as a backup to some 27,000 until it was finally retired in 1998. In June 1974, while President Nixon was on his way to a scheduled stop in Syria, Syrian fighter jets intercepted Air Force One to act as escorts. The crew was not informed in advance, so took evasive action, including a dive. After announcing his intention to resign the presidency, Nixon boarded some 27,000, with call sign Air Force One, to travel to California. Colonel Ralph Albertazzi, then pilot of Air Force One, recounted that after Gerald Ford was sworn in as president, the plane had to be redesignated as some 27,000, indicating no president was on board the aircraft. Over Jefferson City, Missouri, Albertazzi radioed, "Kansas City, this was Air Force One. Will you change our call sign to Sierra Alpha Mike, Sam, 27000. Back came the reply, "Roger, Sierra Alpha Mike 27,000. Good luck to the President." Boeing VC-25, edit. Main article, Boeing VC-25. The Ronald Reagan's 2 terms as president saw no major changes to Air Force One, the manufacture of the presidential aircraft version of the 747 began during his presidency. The USAF issued a request for proposal in 1985 for 2 wide-body aircraft with a minimum of 3 engines and an unrefueled range of 6,000 miles, 9,700 kilometers. Boeing with the 747 and McDonnell Douglas with the DC-10 submitted proposals, and the Reagan administration ordered 2 identical 747s to replace the aging 707 VC-137 variants he used. The interior designs, drawn up by First Lady Nancy Reagan, were reminiscent of the American Southwest. The 11th of September attacks, edit. On the 11th of September, 2001, President George W. Bush was interrupted as he attended an event at Emma E. Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida, after an airplane hit the South Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. He took off on a VC-25 from Sarasota Bradenton International Airport with Colonel Mark Tillman, the senior pilot of Air Force One that day, in charge. Air traffic controllers gave Air Force One an ominous warning that a passenger jet was close to Air Force One and was unresponsive to calls. Tillman recalls, "As we got over Gainesville, Florida, we got the word from Jacksonville Center. They said, 'Air Force One, you have traffic behind you and basically above you that is descending into you. We are not in contact with them, they have shut their responder, SIC, off.' And at that time it kind of led us to believe maybe someone was coming into us in Sarasota. They saw us take off, they just stayed high and are following us at this point. We had no idea what the capabilities of the terrorists were at that point." In response to this reported threat, Colonel Tillman said he flew Air Force One over the Gulf of Mexico to test whether the other aircraft would follow. The other jet continued on its route, and Tillman said that it was later explained to him that an airliner had lost its transponder, which normally broadcasts an electronic identification signal, and that the pilots on board neglected to switch to another radio frequency. A threat came again when Tillman received a message warning of an imminent attack on Air Force One. "We got word from the Vice President and the staff that Angel was next, indicating the classified call sign for Air Force One. Once we got into the Gulf of Mexico, and they passed to us that Angel was next. At that point I asked for fighter support. If an airliner was part of the attack, it would be good to have fighters on the wing to go ahead and take care of us." At this point, Tillman said that the plan to fly the president back to Washington, D.C., was aborted, and instead Tillman landed at Barksdale Air Force Base, Louisiana, and Orfute Air Force Base, Nebraska, where the president made a speech. Tillman explained that this was due to his concern that because of the reported threat, Air Force One would be attacked when he returned to Andrews Air Force Base. After the preliminary stops, the president was returned to Washington, D.C. The next day, officials at the White House and the Justice Department explained that President Bush did this because there was specific and credible information that the White House and Air Force One were also intended targets. The White House could not confirm evidence of a threat made against Air Force One, and investigation found the original claim to be a result of miscommunication. Presidents have invited other world leaders to travel with them on Air Force One at times, including Nixon inviting Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev to travel with him to California from Washington, D.C. in June 1973. In 1983, President Reagan and Queen Elizabeth II toured the U.S. West Coast aboard Air Force One. In March 2012, President Obama took British Prime Minister David Cameron to a basketball game in Ohio aboard Air Force One. 21st Century, edit. When President Bush came to the end of his second term in January 2009, a VC-25 was used to transport him to Texas. For this purpose the aircraft call sign was SAM 28,000, as the aircraft did not carry the current President of the United States. Similar arrangements were made for former Presidents Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama. President Donald Trump flew to his Mar-a-Lago estate shortly before his tenure as president ended, under the Air Force One call sign. After the deaths of former Presidents Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan, VC-25 aircraft flew their remains to their home states of Michigan and California, respectively. On the 27th of April, 2009, a low-flying VC-25 circled New York City for a photo op and training exercise and caused a scare for many in New York. In the 2023 visit by Joe Biden to Ukraine, to increase secrecy, the Air Force One call sign was not used for the C-32 aircraft used to transport President Joe Biden to Poland. Instead, the call sign was SUM 060. Planned replacement, edit. VC-25B, edit. Main article, Boeing VC-25B. The VC-25s are to be replaced as the cost of maintaining the aging systems on their 30-year-old airframes and less efficient GE CF6 engines has begun to surpass the cost of acquiring a new aircraft. On the 28th of January, 2015, the Air Force announced that the Boeing 747-8 would be the next presidential aircraft. On the 6th of December, 2016, President-elect Donald Trump tweeted his opposition to the Air Force One replacement because of its high cost, more than $4 billion. The U.S. Government Accountability Office estimated the total cost at $3.2 billion, and the U.S. Air Force's budget for the program is projected to be nearly $4 billion. In December 2016, Boeing was on contract for preliminary development worth $170 million, $212 million in 2023. On the 1st of August, 2017, Defense One reported that, in an effort to pay less for the replacement program, the U.S. Air Force contracted to purchase two of the bankrupt Russian airline Transaero's undelivered 747-8 Intercontinentals from Boeing, which was storing them in the Mojave Desert to prevent corrosion. These airplanes, which were completed in 2013, would be retrofitted with all essential equipment to serve as the next presidential aircraft, albeit without certain capabilities such as aerial refueling. Supersonic aircraft, edit. In September 2020, the U.S. Air Force announced several presidential and executive airlift directorate contracts signed with aircraft manufacturers to begin development of a supersonic aircraft that could function as Air Force One. Contracts have been signed with Exosnic, Hormuz, and Boom. Other presidential aircraft, edit. During the Johnson administration, the United States Air Force acquired a Beechcraft King Air B-90 which was designated VC-60, 66-to-7943. The aircraft was used to transport President Johnson between Bergstrom Air Force Base and his family ranch near Johnson City, Texas, and was used at least once to transport the President to Princeton, New Jersey. It was referred to as Lady Bird's airplane and later in its service life featured a basic color scheme similar to civilian aircraft. When the President was aboard, the aircraft used the call sign Air Force One. United Airlines is the only commercial airline to have operated Executive One, the call sign given to a civilian flight on which the U.S. President is aboard. On the 26th of December, 1973, President Richard Nixon and his family flew as commercial passengers on a United DC-10 from Washington Dulles to Los Angeles International Airport. His staff explained that this was done to conserve fuel by not having to fly the usual Boeing 707 Air Force aircraft. In November 1999, President Bill Clinton flew from Ankara, Turkey, to see Engis Topel Naval Air Station outside Izmit, Turkey, aboard a marked C-20C, Gulfstream 3, using the call sign Air Force One, escorted by 3 F-16s. On the 8th of March, 2000, President Clinton flew to Pakistan aboard an unmarked Gulfstream 3 while another aircraft with the call sign Air Force One flew on the same route a few minutes later. This diversion was reported by several U.S. press outlets. On the 1st of May, 2003, President George W. Bush flew in the co-pilot seat of a Sea Control Squadron 35, VS-35, S-3B Viking from Naval Air Station North Island, California to the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln off the California coast, where Bush delivered his mission accomplished speech. During the flight, the aircraft used the call sign of Navy One for the first time. This aircraft is now on display at the National Naval Aviation Museum at Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida. Barack Obama used the Gulfstream C-37 variant on a personal trip in 2009 to visit the production of August Wilson's Joe Turner's Come and Gone in New York. Several Boeing C-17